Okay, I see people entering, and so we will get started with our event today. So welcome to our Lab to Table event, Genetic Information, Balancing Ethics and Impact. I am Aaron Conley. I'm the Director of External Affairs, Partnerships, and Communications for the School of Medicine Basic Sciences, which is hosting this event today as part of a monthly series of conversations connecting biomedical research to real-life topics. And today we'll be discussing genetic information, both its ethics and its impact. So where does this frame for this discussion? What is the framing of this discussion? So the Human Genome Project took more than 13 years and $2.7 billion to complete the first genetic sequencing of a human. Now that was more than 20 years ago. Now full genetic sequencing only costs hundreds of dollars and takes a relatively short amount of time. And it has been integrated into medical care, genealogy, forensic, and business, among other spaces. But given the newness of all this genomic information being integrated into broad segments of society and medicine, there's so many questions about how this data can best be used for the good of health and society, as well as its ethics of privacy and any potential problems with the availability of individuals' genomic information. So today we are very excited to have with us experts in biomedical research, forensics, and ethics to discuss these topics. So without further ado, I'm excited for the panelists to introduce themselves. Ellen, would you please start?
Sure. I'm Ellen Wright-Clayton. I am a pediatrician, law professor, and ethicist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And I have been thinking about ethical and legal and social implications of genetics for many years, since I was in law school. And I imagine you'll call on Brad next, but he and I lead a very big center on privacy that I'm sure he'll say more about.
And Brad.
I guess I have to talk about the center. So I'm Brad Mallon. So I'm a professor of biomedical informatics, biostatistics, and computer science at Vanderbilt. Along with Ellen, we run what is called the Center for, well, simple word is the Get Precise Center. It's a center of excellence in ethical, legal, and social implications research from the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH. And we've been working on issues around genetic privacy and aspects of personal identity for almost 10 years now.
Thank you very much, Brad. And last but not least, Daniela.
Good morning, I guess, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Daniele Podini. I am a professor of forensic molecular biology at the George Washington University. And my background is law enforcement. So I actually started off in law enforcement as a biologist in the crime lab in the Carabinieri in Italy. And then after a long journey, I ended up here in Washington, D.C., and I'm currently the chair of the Department of Forensic Sciences. My research focuses on applying molecular biology methods to identify individuals for the purposes of, obviously, criminal investigations.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And we're going to start with a pretty broad question for you all, and we can start with Ellen. Just broadly speaking, how is genetic information being used in society?
Gosh, in a variety of ways. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about in law enforcement, but in fact, it's being used in research, it's being used in clinical care to help us define the diseases that people have, what and how best to treat them. And then increasingly, people are getting this information in part to find out what part of the world their ancestors came from, and in part to find relatives. And it turns out that there are estimates that 100 million people have done this, indicating, which totally swamps what we're doing in healthcare and research.
That is an amazing amount of data. Brad or Daniela, do you have anything to add about the broad use of genetic information?
Sure. So the growth of the amount of information has actually been quite substantial, as you alluded to when you were first introducing the panel. This has been partially an artifact of the way that sequencing technology has reduced in cost dramatically over the last, I don't know, decade or so. But it's also in combination with two other aspects. One is really the rise of just general personal consumer services around genomics, in that that genomic data has kind of leapt from your traditional biomedical research, clinical care environment into what we've seen is called recreational genomics. So this is why you've seen companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA and over 100 other direct-to-consumer genomics companies that are genetic testing companies that have really made it cheap and easy for people to generate information or genomic information that is easy to store and transfer and just reason over. And so that's one of the reasons why you're seeing like such a massive growth. And as you've democratized the accessibility of this data, the ways in which they have become used have completely exploded, right? It's gone not just from providing people with an intuition into like what traits they might have or what particular clinical phenomena they may be exposed to in the future, but how are you related to people who you might not have had known that you had a relationship with, biological relationship with, without this type of investigation.
So from a forensic perspective, as forensic scientists, we've kind of always taken advantage of what other people were doing in the clinical world and used it for our purposes. And the kind of historical examples are like blood types, right? In the Landsteiner, I think it was in the late 1920s, discovered the blood groups for the purpose of transfusions, so that they could transfuse the right blood. And then we as forensic scientists took advantage of it to help us identify, not really identify, it was more to kind of exclude suspects from being contributors to a blood stain. Fast forward, 100 years, and here we are now taking advantage of 23andMe and people's eager to discover where their origins are and uploading their data on these publicly shared databases to find relatives. And as forensic scientists, we can use it to identify individuals whose DNA was left at the crime scene, but are not part of the conventional forensic databases. So there's kind of an overlap between our purpose and what a tool was initially designed for.
And that brings up some really big implications and questions. So as Brad said, there's now take-home tests from places like 23andMe and others that anyone can test their DNA and then upload it. And that data can be used in different ways. So in thinking about that, Brad and Ellen, and then we can get to Danielle, what are some of the ethical implications of disclosing genetic information as individuals and family? And is genetic information used for tracking people in this day and age?
Well, I don't think we've quite gotten to Gattaca, where they did that all the time, but certainly the potential is in the future, so that I think remains to be seen. But I think the important point about this is that when people put identified genetic information in the public, about themselves, that it necessarily implicates their relatives. And so if my sisters or my cousins post information about that, then there's information, at least some, about me as well. And this is, as Daniela said, this is what the forensic scientists take advantage of. But the idea that, but it makes really clear that we live in a web of relationships. And when we reveal information about ourselves, we also reveal information about a whole lot of other people. And that's just intrinsic in this.
So let me build on that for a second. the situation that Ellen's alluding to is it's a belief that the familial relationships are defined by biological relationships, and that's not necessarily the case. So when you're choosing to disclose information about your genome, and that may certainly wrap up other people that you're biologically related to that you might not have talked to and ask them how they, what their perception is on the sharing of such information. It also has implications for people that you don't necessarily have a direct biological relationship with, and you might not have actually disclosed that information to them quite yet. So it starts to beg this question of what's the definition of family, what's the definition of a relationship that I don't think is completely really articulated. The other one has to do with just what is the information going to be used for? And so there's this belief that information is going to be shared to some service under some contract or some consensual model. But that implies that the information is being provided in return for either some service or some expected return on investment. And sometimes you don't know what that is going to be. And there can end up being unforeseen uses that you didn't necessarily agree to in the past, or when you first signed up for some type of a service. And I think that that's one of the things that has really made people a little bit queasy about the disclosure of personal information. It's that you think you might be doing one thing today, and a lot of people will be like, yeah, I'm going to get super amounts of enjoyment by finding like how many people I'm related to that I didn't know I had a relationship with. And then, 1 year down the line, somebody comes back to you and says, hey, the police are using your DNA. And then you're like, wait, huh? But that's not what I got involved in. And so there's this question about, do you know what you're doing from the outset?
And that's such an important question. And Danielle, could you comment on just the thoughts from the forensic genetics community on use of genealogical data, the positives of that, the negatives or ethical considerations of that?
Yeah, so initially, I think with the first case where genetic genealogy was used to identify the Golden State, sorry, thank you, killer. At that time, when people were uploading their genetic information on GEDmatch, which was the website that they were using, they weren't consenting or not consenting to sharing that to the use of that data for other purposes other than identifying their own relatives. But now, after these cases came about, and this new application or this new use of these databases became known, they included a checkbox where people have to consent to the use of their own genome that they're uploading for the purposes of identifying for criminal investigations. And of course, like we said, they're consenting for their own genome, but indirectly they're consenting for all their relatives, their biological relatives. So that's an ethical issue, and this is not a new issue really, because there's before forensic genetic genealogy, people were using the conventional forensic database, that's the convicted offender database, that's based on genetic markers that don't carry much other information other than the ability to provide identification for identifying potential relatives. So doing kind of a low stringency search into the convicted offender database of the profile that was found at the crime scene, or using the Y chromosome to identify paternal relatives of this person. And that was an issue that in some states, for example, I believe the state of Maryland kind of limited the use of this familial search because of this reason. People were you were indirectly searching people that weren't in the database, that weren't convicted offenders, that did not give their consent. So that's considered obviously an issue. Now, if you look at it the other way, these methods, these technologies now have been able to identify people that committed crimes that had hurt other people. And so to society, you bring closure for certain cases, right? For certain families, you prevent potential murders or sexual assaults. So it has a benefit, to society, and it's very, very tangible and measurable. So the issue is, how do we balance these two things? And I am a molecular biologist, I'm a forensic scientist, and I come from law enforcement. So obviously I have my own perspective. As long as it doesn't hurt anybody, you should use it if it's helping society. But at the same time, I do realize that people are in there indirectly without giving their consent. So what's the right thing to do? But that's why we have ethicists. I think that's how you say it.
Yeah, Brad and Ellen, please. How do we balance these?
This is going to be fun. So one of the things I wanted to point out is, I don't think that we can put all of our faith in the notion of consent. The reason why I bring this up is that the Golden State Killer case is really fascinating. Let's take a step back for a second. So what ended up happening was that the organization that was collecting individuals' personal genomes said, okay, maybe we shouldn't have allowed the FBI to come in and just have willy-nilly access to all of the genomes that have been put here. So let's ask people if they want to have their genome used for the investigation of some violent crime. And so then some people said, sure, you can do this. Other people said, I'm not comfortable with this, or they didn't respond. So after that happened, once that was put in place, you had a situation in Florida where a detective ended up going to directly to the courts and said, I need to solve a crime. These consents are getting in my way. I don't care if somebody consented or not. Give me access to the entire database. And the judge came back and said, cool, yep, you can have that. And so the whole notion of consent just went out the window, and it was a complete false promise from the organization. Now, they didn't necessarily intend on that, but it's a situation in which they've consented people in a manner that I would argue it's not a contract that could be satisfied. And that's probably something that they could have had some insight into up front. So that's one thing I just want to point out, that even when people think they understand what they're getting involved in, they don't necessarily understand what they're getting involved in, especially when law enforcement is potentially at the table, because the amount of resources and this support that law enforcement ends up having behind it, once they say, we're here to solve a murder investigation, it changes the dynamic a little bit. A lot. I shouldn't say a little.
Well, there are actually a couple more things to say about this. One is that we've actually done some work asking people what they think about if information about them had been used to hire somebody who, or find somebody who had committed a serious crime. And the fact of the matter is, some people say that'd be great. Some people say it's not great. And so the idea that people are univocal in what they think about having DNA about them used to find a criminal is not true. Another thing to say that is really remarkable about this direct-to-consumer genetic testing is that CODIS, the database to which you referred earlier, Daniela, is mostly composed of people who have been convicted of serious crimes or arrested, and it mostly represents one segment of the population, whereas the use of direct-to-consumer genetic testing is very heavily people of Northern European ancestry. So this is a completely different demographic. I mean, the reason the Golden State Killer was found, he was a white policeman. He certainly wasn't going to be in CODIS, but relatives of his had used Ancestry or 23andMe. And so you could say that actually it's a justice concern to say that we ought to be using the results of direct-to-consumer genetic testing so that forensic searches aren't biased. And in fact, Brad and I and others published an article a few years ago advocating universal genetic testing to avoid this bias problem. We knew we would get a lot of pushback, and we did, but I mean, but there are real issues here.
Well, let's clarify that. I'm sorry, I have to jump back in, and then I'll yield the floor. The article that we had published, we're academics, of course, we're going to point people towards articles, but the article was advocating for a situation in which we could level the playing field so that you could have some type of a centralized database, something like CODIS, that ensured that we were all in the boat together. So take everybody's DNA, put it into the pot, but then when the time came to do some type of an investigation, there could be some degree of oversight such that there could be either a federal body or some type of a state body that could say, yeah, it's time to move forward. Society has agreed. This is something that we can do or should do, but everybody has an equal chance of getting investigated from the outset of that.
So that you
And I will
would
agree with
have a
Ellen, it definitely
warrant.
raised the heckles of people.
So you would have to have a warrant or a subpoena or some kind of oversight in order even to get access to the database. So thank you for making that point, Brad.
Yeah, from my perspective, that makes a lot of sense. And I agree that searching the Y chromosome of convicted offenders is clearly biased towards, populations that are more represented in the CODIS database than others, whereas it kind of, who's laughing now with the 23andMe and the public the ancestry.com things, because obviously it's more white people of European descent that are interested in understanding their where they come from, and so it's kind of biased towards that population. I don't really have a solution for it, but other than the one you propose, which is obviously going to be controversial. Yes, you could swab every child or just collect a little blood sample from the newborns and store them in a database, and then get access to it with a warrant if need be. But I don't think that society is ready for that. But again,
It's not.
Society has not. The notion of surveillance and having full surveillance all the time is something that, especially in the United States, we have tried very hard not to have. And it has, it is really just a matter of freedom in many people's perspectives, that if there are certain inalienable rights, and the right to be in a genomic database with everybody else's database is not one of those things.
Yeah, and there's also possible mistakes or errors that can come from that. Somebody may leave their DNA at a crime scene, or it may be transferred. There may not be, may not have any responsibility. So there's some issues there too. So it's not, it's not a black and white issue. And I guess the monitoring or the safety nets that you would have to prevent mishaps in using such a database would be very difficult to develop and implement. So yeah, I don't know if I would want my DNA in there. So, I don't want to be a hypocrite here, even though I'm not a criminal.
No, it's such a complicated question.
I don't even have a Facebook page, right? And I don't have a LinkedIn page because I don't like it to have to be out there. So I don't think I'd share my DNA. But although my students have a lot of my DNA profiles because I, give my blood and my saliva for their mock cases.
That is very funny.
My DNA profile is out there.
So Ellen and Brad, what are the other complications with genealogical data outside of just forensics?
Well, I would say number one is that there are two parts of it. One is that very often who you think your family member, who you're biologically related to, isn't actually accurate. And this can come in a variety of ways. It can come from adoption. It can come from infidelity. It can come from any number of things. And you know, in the literature, both academic and importantly, you know, in the public literature is full of cases where people found out that they weren't related to who they thought they were, and the level of upset that that talked about. It means that, for instance, 50 years ago, when you gave a child up for adoption, the standard was that you would give the child up, and then the child would, you would have no more connection with the child, and the child would have no more connection with you. You cannot give up a child for adoption and guarantee that that child is not going to find out who you are. I mean, it just isn't possible to say that anymore. So, you know, so that causes a variety of upset in terms of how we think about how families govern themselves, how they think about this. But the other thing to say that Brad also pointed out is that it really embodies a notion that the only thing that matters for family is who you're genetically connected to. And that's emphatically wrong. Families are constructed in a variety of different ways, and there are serious families of care, and we've seen abuses by the government, as we saw a couple of years ago when people who were immigrating at the border, they would do genetic tests to decide whether the kids were related to the adults, and if they weren't, they took them away, even though the adults were the ones who were caring for them, and it might very well have been, you know, one of these larger families of care. So, you know, so one of the things that is ironic about this is that a lot of us spend a lot of time saying that genetics is not all of who you are. I mean, it's part of who you are, but there are many other things about who you are. But this kind of genetic essentialism about what constitutes a family just flies in the face of that in a way that is really, really harmful. So, I mean, this is something that I think is a terrible problem for our society, because frankly, we need families to pull together, however it is that they're constructed, and to be recognized that way.
Ellen hit a lot of the nails on the head. I'll follow up with one more nail, which is in this situation specifically, in the forensic case, I think it's unfair. Maybe unfair is not the right word, but it is a potential anguish-inducing situation to go to somebody and say, we believe that somebody in your family may have committed this violent crime, and we want you to tell us who they are. And now you've put this person in a situation of, do they honor their duty to family and protect their family members, or do they honor their duty to protect society? I think everybody would agree that violent crime is a horrible thing, and we just experienced this in Nashville. At the same time, this does have the potential to really draw a line in the sand and say, are you with your family, or are you with society? And people didn't ask for that necessarily. Now, of course, you have to do things that you don't necessarily ask for, but it is going to push that measure into the front and center situation.
So there's a few things I want to say. I'll try to be brief. Like, kind of starting from the end, I would say that in a way, though, some of these choices were already there, right? It could be, oh, I saw a license plate that looks like your cousin's car. Do you know where he was at the time of the crime? So, I mean, it's just that there's more chances of it, and there's a different technological era, but those choices were there even before, just maybe less chances of these choices, but they were still part of our life. And in a way, I feel like using, for example, DNA at a crime scene to predict someone's physical trait and ancestry may be more accurate or more or less biased than an eyewitness testimony saying that it was a person of this ethnicity and you know, this height and so forth, because maybe they can't, they've had previous experiences that in a way bias their perception of reality. Starting from the beginning of what we talked about, actually, some of the things Ellen said hit close to home. I have 3 adopted kids. They are adopted from Asia, different parts of Asia. So they've always known they're adopted, but eventually through these technologies, they may find their relatives. And so obviously we're completely open about it, and eventually they might choose to do it, and when they want, right? So that's a good thing, hopefully, right? We don't know. You know, when I hear people saying family, yeah, for me they're my kids. You know, maybe they don't have my genes directly, but they're my kids, and so they are my family. And this is a philosophical thing that's very personal, but you know, if we zoom out of time 100,000 years, all of us here are probably related. If 500,000 years we start being related with a lot of animals, 1 billion years ago we're related to some plants, okay, or you know, some yeast somewhere. So you know, we're all related in a way. We're all family on this planet, I feel. You know, that's a philosophical hill that I give you.
No, but I think that's an important point to make, especially in the complicated notion of family. Now, one thing that's been brought up a few times is just like you're saying, compared to an eyewitness. Could you speak a little bit more to how accurate forensic genetics is, how sensitive the detection mechanisms are, and how these are advancing criminal justice?
Yeah, so we can generate the conventional DNA profile from as little as 10, 15 cells, a reliable profile of good quality cells. So the good thing is that it's very sensitive. The bad thing that we're seeing now, that it's not, the issue is becoming not anymore whose DNA it is, but how did it get there? So a DNA is found on a gun, and it's a mixture of multiple contributors, so it's already difficult to interpret. But let's say that you're able to identify someone as a contributor, and that person may say, well, I never touched that gun, it was in my car, and Joe left it in my car when he saw the police. He ran away, we call him Joe, I don't know who he is, but that's not my gun. It's got my DNA because it's in my car, and maybe I high-fived Joe before he got in my car. And so those are the difficult, that's what's becoming a challenge. In terms of predicting ancestry, you maybe need a little more DNA than you know, 10, 15 cells, but you're still able to quite accurately predict populations that are of one, like either European Americans or African Americans or East Asians. It's more complicated more difficult to accurately predict admixed individuals. So people that have parents from 2 different ethnicities. Physical traits, you know, some physical traits are polymorphic, meaning they present themselves in different ways only in one population. Think of eye color, right? Mostly Europeans have different eye color, and eye color can actually be predicted pretty well, especially blue eyes and brown eyes can be predicted well. It's difficult to predict the intermediate hazel green eyes. Those are more challenging to accurately predict. Hair color less accurately, skin pigmentation even less accurately. But now I think where the field is going is looking at not only DNA sequence actual, but what happens to the DNA after birth, and what's referred to as epigenetics. So you can look at methylation of the DNA and predict the age of a person. Now, it's not accurate as, you get somebody's birthday, but you can pretty well determine if a person is in their 20s versus in their 40s versus in their 60s. And so that could be another piece of information, a piece of the investigative kind of let's say the toolbox of the investigator is something else that can be used to help identify potential suspects. Now, these things don't necessarily identify the person, but they can help rule out certain individuals, all kind of optimize their resources in the investigation. At the end of the day, though, once you identify the person, just like in the case of the Golden State Killer, is a conventional cheek swab and looking at the conventional STR profile. STR stands for short tandem repeats, which is the genetic marker that is used for forensic identification that the CODIS database is made of.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that, Daniela. That really showcases the different tools now available and their accuracy. And shifting a little bit, Ellen and Brad, we also think about the tools in medicine, and we've talked about kind of biases and issues in forensics. What are the opportunities and challenges for making genetic testing accessible and affordable to all patients, regardless of socioeconomic status? And how can we avoid exacerbating health disparities in this medical genetic testing space?
Well, I would say the number one thing we have to do is get databases that are more representative of the entire population here in the United States, which is incredibly diverse, as you know. And so there is tremendous amount of effort in the research space to increase the diversity of participants in this research so that we can learn more about how genetic variation contributes to human health and disease. And Brad knows a ton about this since he's a leader of the All of Us program. And so that's a first thing. And then another thing to do is that a challenge in getting greater representation is for people to feel safe and interested in thinking that this is a good kind of research to participate in. And that's hard to do in a society like ours, which has a history of racism and sexism and other kinds of discrimination. And so we have to do the science, but we have to do the science in a way that's really going to be focused on providing help to people and not leading to further discrimination.
So there are two issues that I wanted to bring up. One, there's the notion of cost and equitable distribution of cost. So right now, you can get an insurer to pay for a whole genome sequence if an individual has a certain type of cancer. And however, you can't necessarily get an insurer to pay for a $50 genotyping panel to determine if an individual has a predisposition towards hypertension or hyperlipidemia. So this is a problem, right? This is an issue with healthcare in that in the US, we tend to have this retrospective look, and that when something happens, something goes wrong, we're like, cool, we will pay for that and we will try and fix it. But the notion of like prospective, let's try to keep the person healthy from the outset, it's something that we want to strive for. It's not always as easy to motivate in the payment world. The other thing is that this notion of payments, I think Ellen also, this builds on what she was saying, you don't have equitable distribution of insurance and you don't have equitable distribution of cost support for people who do want to actually have some type of genetic testing performed for them. So that's a major challenge, that it's not a genetic problem. That just has to do with the distribution of resources and support within our society. That's a systemic problem. The second issue has to do with trust. And this is going to permeate a lot of what we continue to talk about probably for the rest of this session. There are certainly challenges associated with how do you convince somebody that they should have their genotype or that they should have their genetic sequence created? And that level of trust sometimes has to do with the way in which patients interact with their care providers, or potential research participants are going to interact with programs that the NIH might sponsor. And that's, trust is not equally distributed across the country as well. If I pivot a little bit from the notion of the clinical world over to the research world, this has been a problem with scientific research for decades. And part of the problem is that we in many respects, we have broken that trust. And there is clear indications that certain I don't want to say necessarily minorities, because we've gotten to the point in society where we don't necessarily have all complete minorities in a historical sense, but we've gotten to the point where there are underrepresented groups in biomedical research that trying to convince them to come back and contribute DNA or contribute clinical information for investigations is not as simple as just saying, we want you to be part of the solution, because you have to really build out that platform for whatever trust is going to be. And we could speak a long time around what that is. I just want to point out that it's not as simple as just acknowledging the problem, but you have to have a plan for potentially solving it.
And that's a huge issue. Trust is such a huge issue. And just thinking about it from an individual's perspective, entering this conversation, either with genealogical data or medical data, what should they be looking for, and how can they control their own DNA?
Well, it's awfully hard to control your own DNA. And the truth is, direct-to-consumer genetic testing is a big reason for that. If 100 million people have done this, and if 100 million people each have 20 relatives, that makes a lot of people. And so, so the idea that so first of all, that's part of it. The other part of it is that information flows throughout the healthcare system. It flows both within delivery of healthcare, within delivery of healthcare research. I have to say that I think that most data flow within healthcare institutions is probably more secure than most other healthcare flow, because it matters so much to healthcare institutions to protect the data they have, because we have an obligation to protect the confidentiality of our patients. So, but the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of data out there, and the big one is direct to consumer. There's nothing of forensic databases and a few other things like that, but all of that pales in comparison to direct-to-consumer genetic testing.
Thank you very much, Alan. Brad, anything to add to that?
No.
Sounds good. Well, I think we're going to do one more question, and then we'll get to some of the registrant and Q&A questions. And this question's for all of you, and we can start with Daniela. What do you see the future of genetic information looking like in forensics? And then for Brad and Ellen, forensics, society, and medicine.
Oh, I know. I have no idea how it's going to go, right? I have no idea. What I tell my students, I know the technology you're going to use in your first case when you walk out of here, but I have no clue all the things you're going to have to learn and what technology is going to be available on your last case before you retire. And I think, as we've seen with genetic data, it's being used in a completely different way. And in fact, an issue with conducting research on human subjects is there's these repositories of samples collected in the past 30 years, with consent, saying, to the person was consenting for the use of their DNA for research applications. But at the time, nobody had a clue of the things that you could do with a sample nowadays. So is it fair to use those samples and maybe potentially being able to identify these people or not? What, what do you do? So I don't have an answer for a question, really. I know it's going to be interesting. I know we all have to kind of work as a society, work together to figure out, to balance what's best for society, what's best for the individual. How do you protect people's wishes? But sorry, I'm not an ethicist. I guess I can't expand more than that.
I don't think it's necessarily an ethics question from the outset. Like, technology moves at a rate that is constantly accelerating. And so I think we've gotten to the point where we know what DNA is. We know how to sequence most of it relatively efficiently. There are certain parts of the genome that we can't sequence quite as effectively as we want. Like, it took, it was very easy to sequence most of the genome. It was really hard to sequence the telomeres. We're still working out the technology to do telomeres in an effective manner. What I think is going to be really interesting to watch is just how is the data going to be used? Because the cost of data, the cost of storing it, the cost of processing it is also rapidly going down. And so as a result, this is one of the reasons why you see we've moved towards this trend of collect as much data as you can, store it for as long as you can, and then hopefully we're going to be able to process it and do really cool analysis with it. And once you start to democratize that type of technology, the market is going to start creating applications that you never would have dreamed about. My suspicion, you're going to start seeing things like compatibility testing that is outside the scope of like what you would normally do in a clinical setting, to say, what's the chance that like a potential child is or fetus is going to have like some type of a disease that says that they would die in the womb. This is going to be like, you've got person A, they've got their genome, you got person B, they've got their genome, and they say, how much of a match are we? Now, what is the definition of a match? Is it like, how far away are they in like the biological sense, so that like you don't have like first cousins marrying each other? I don't know. It's unclear what exactly that's going to look like. But if there's going to be an opportunity for a company to commercialize it, yeah, it'll happen. And if people see that there will be benefit in doing so, and they'll have some type of commercial gain off of it, it'll happen. It's going to be, I don't think you can predict exactly what the future is going to hold, but once the ability to make cheap and reliable access to this data possible, which we're starting to get there, we're still relatively very much at the beginning of that innovation curve, because 23andMe made it cheap to collect the data, and they'll provide you results off of it, but they're still not giving you like a whole genome sequence back into the palm of your hand that you can then use on your iPhone. That's not where we are yet today, but I don't think that the future is too far away.
Thank you, Brad. Alan?
So actually, I have a very different take on this. I mean, I certainly do think that the pressure to give greater and greater weight to the importance of genetic information is going to be there. And there's going to be a lot of effort to commercialize it and make predictions on the base of it. I do, however, think that what we need to do is also, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of genetics, in part because I think it's an unbelievable tool toward understanding biology. And I think it gives us all kinds of ways to think about making things better. But I do think that it is up to us to resist the idea that genetics is the be all and end all. I was listening to Daniela talk about his kids, and I thought, yeah, that's right. I mean, that his family is his family because of what he does, not because of the genetic connections. And so I think that we have to think about how we have to think about variation and difference and responding to it in a way that actually improves things for all people rather than heightens antipathy. I think that's a big goal, but I think it's what we have to aspire to.
Yes, and I think that's so important, especially in the polarization that we've been seeing. How do we aspire to that? There's a few questions in the Q&A about, are there international laws governing the use of genetic information and any recourses if nations violate these, and or just differences? Maybe Danielle, you could start just with differences you've seen in working in Europe versus working in the US, and then we could go to Brad on other cases of law. And Ellen.
I don't know of any specific law that regulates the use, international law that regulates the use. I know there's in collaboration between law enforcement institutions. And so there's been a kind of an agreement on the genetic regions that are used to generate a DNA profile for purpose of identification, so that they can be shared between in Europol or Interpol or the FBI that holds CODIS, so that they can identify people that may be in the database. In terms of the application, I feel that here, and it's true for many disciplines, I think there's a lot more. The lawyers tend to be a lot more aggressive in combating the law enforcement and technology that may be used in the criminal field than in Europe. I think there's a little bit more trust in Europe that the scientists are going to do the right thing, which is not always true, but I feel that's kind of a perception. And people may disagree. This is very personal opinion. I guess in a way, right, the medical system, the costs are so high here in the US, also because of malpractice issues, and versus Europe, there's less of that. So maybe that's true also in the forensic field a bit in a different way. But
thank you, Danielle. Brad, would you want to comment on that, or Ellen want to comment on that with international laws related to this?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. So first, in the US, we have a different perspective on the way in which biospecimens and data derived from biospecimens are protected. So we tend to take this perspective that if the individual sheds a cell or leaves their DNA someplace, that it's considered to be abandoned. And this notion of abandoned DNA isn't quite interpreted exactly the same way in Europe. And because what it means is that in the US, you can use an individual's DNA for purposes that they didn't necessarily agree to. So one thing we didn't talk about earlier is that with some of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies, there's actually an encouragement to do what's called surreptitious testing. So in surreptitious testing, you can have a company that says, hey, so do you think your spouse is cheating on you? Send us an article of clothing that might have some type of blood or saliva on it, and we'll take a look and see just whose DNA is there, or if there's more than one person's DNA. And this is something that's much harder to do in the European context than in the US, because you don't have affirmative consent from those individuals for doing so. That's one issue. The second issue I was going to point out is that under the general data protection regulation in Europe, which gets implemented and interpreted by different countries differently, but under GDPR, there's genetic information is explicitly called out as being personal sensitive information. And now we have some variations on this in the US at the state level. We don't have this at the federal level, but as a result, what that means is that it's much more difficult to just allow for the free exchange and reuse of genomic information in a European context. And for this reason, this was one of the reasons why some of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies they closed up shop and they moved out of Europe in particular. So 23andMe was trying to do things in Europe, and then they realized that this was not something that they could really use as a completely viable business model. And so that didn't really go in the same direction that it did in the United States. So there are differences in that regard. Now, there was a question about what happens when you take information out of the United States and move it out into Europe. And all I'm going to say is I'm not going to comment on that because I've already said too much, making it seem like I'm a lawyer when I'm not one.
Well, thank you.
And I'll just say a couple of quick things. I do think that there is movement in this country to do more about data privacy. We are nowhere near where the EU is, but I think frankly, in an international world, we are going to have to move more or less to an EU type model with the GDPR. We will go kicking and screaming, but nonetheless, I think that's probably where we're going to end up. And the other thing that I would say is, at least in the United States, if someone takes your DNA, there's nobody you can sue. I mean, you can't sue your relatives if they share their information. And if the companies do something, all the obligations are enforced by the government, and you don't have a private right of action. So you have almost no control unless you do something really like a hidebound contract, which would be hard to come by.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And this will be our last question. Kellen Cunningham asks, could you say a bit more about practices currently in place for building trust in physician-patient relationships when genetic testing is in question? Do you think addressing this issue requires structural institutional changes, or is it by training physicians and healthcare providers?
Well, I guess I get to take that one. I think that our healthcare system right now is under enormous stress in general. And one of the things that we know from a lot of research that we've done is that the use of genetics in the clinical space is actually quite variable by specialty. Some of them are really fairly sophisticated, others of them are less so. And I think that the issues that we need to deal with are dealing with the concern that the physician is caring for the patient and is open to hearing what the patient has to say. I'm getting ready to write a talk about ChatGPT later this week, and it's pretty clear that patients understand that that's coming, but they want to make sure that their doctor is still in the loop. And then I think also just being more responsive to the needs of the patient across the board. So this is a much more systemic problem than is just what exists within genetics.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And thank you all, Ellen, Brad, and Daniela, for joining us. Any closing thoughts on this topic before we close out the event?
Well, my closing thought is these are enormously exciting scientific developments. And the thing we need to do is to focus on the benefits that they can convey while keeping in mind the potentials for misuse, and thinking about how to ameliorate those. I mean, this is not unique to genetics. This is absolutely inherent in all advances in our society. But I think that the determinism part makes it even harder here. And it just means that we have to pay more attention and work harder. So I hope this has been helpful.
I will say that I will agree that the challenges that we're facing are complex. There's contradictions that are being put on the table as well. Some of the issue, it would help to have resolutions that are based on societal discussion and deliberation, as opposed to leaving things completely ambiguous for the courts to weigh in on. I think that that's one of the things that leaves people with a lot of uncertainty. Along these lines, I think that there's really amazing opportunities for the future for use of the information as well as protection of the information. It just is going to require some forethought.
I'll just say something for the students that are out there who are interested in the field, and you see how broad the field is. I think the excitement is that you will be able to continue to learn all your life. So be prepared to learn new things. I guess learn to learn. That's really the best skill to have.
Well, it's been a learned experience for me today, and I hope everyone involved in listening to this conversation. Thank you all so much again for being on this panel, and to all the listeners out there. We will be sharing a link to the recording of this event, which will be uploaded to YouTube that you can share elsewhere. And please join us for another event in the future. So thank you all so very much, and I hope you all have a great day. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.